Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
The tangled world of Port Charles has always thrived on secrets, lies, and the explosive consequences that follow when the truth finally comes out, and Jason Morgan has often found himself at the center of those battles. When whispers began circulating that something wasn't right with Ronnie Domestico, many fans of General Hospital could feel a storm brewing long before Jason ever pieced it together. Ronnie had long projected himself as a loyal cop, someone dedicated to law and order even in a town where justice is often bent and shaped to fit the most powerful players. For years, his friendship with Dante Falconeri gave him cover, painting him as someone reliable, trustworthy, and even protective. Yet, the cracks in his facade were there all along, small details that Jason, with his instinct for sniffing out betrayal, began to notice. The moment Jason started to question why certain busts were going sideways, or why criminals seemed to always be one step ahead of law enforcement, the trail led him back to Ronnie. The truth was like a slow burn, simmering beneath the surface, until it erupted in a shocking confrontation that no one in Port Charles would soon forget. Jason had always trusted his gut more than he trusted words, and in this case, his instincts screamed that Ronnie was playing both sides. The shift started with minor inconsistencies. He overheard conversations where Ronnie's version of events didn't line up with Dante's reports. He noticed a hesitation in Ronnie's tone when asked about cases that should have been clear-cut. More importantly, Jason realized that whenever he or Sonny Corinthos were cornered, the trap always seemed to have a hole big enough to escape through, almost as if someone on the inside was orchestrating the game. At first, it looked like protection, but Jason began to suspect it was something far more sinister: manipulation. Ronnie wasn't saving anyone, he was controlling the board, making sure he stayed one step ahead while throwing others under the bus when necessary. Jason knew he had to move carefully. A man like Ronnie, with deep ties to the police force and connections nobody fully understood, was dangerous to expose without evidence. The turning point came when Sam McCall started doing her own digging. She'd overheard Ronnie on a phone call, his voice laced with anger as he barked threats at someone she couldn't identify. The words didn't sound like a cop protecting justice, they sounded like a man protecting his own corrupt empire. Sam shared what she heard with Jason, and together they began piecing together a timeline that painted Ronnie as far from innocent. Jason's protective instincts flared, especially knowing that Ronnie had close access not only to Dante but to Lulu Spencer, Maxie Jones, and other people Jason cared about indirectly. The web was sticky, and the danger of exposing Ronnie grew greater with every step forward. Still, Jason wasn't one to back down from uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. Ronnie's downfall truly began with his arrogance. Like so many villains before him, he believed he was untouchable. He spoke too freely in places he thought were safe, left traces of money that didn't belong in his accounts, and underestimated Jason's persistence. Jason followed the money trail with Spinelli's help, and what they uncovered was staggering. Ronnie wasn't just skimming on the side or working a single racket, he was running a shadow operation, dealing with mobsters and criminals while using his badge as protection. Worse still, he was willing to frame anyone who got too close. Jason realized that if Ronnie suspected he was under investigation, Sam or even Dante himself could be his next pawn or his next victim. That thought hardened Jason's resolve. This wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about protecting people from a man who had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. The day of the confrontation was as tense as any moment Jason had faced in his long, violent life. Ronnie cornered Maxie Jones, his desperation making him reckless. He threatened her, revealing the side of himself that he had kept carefully hidden under the badge. Jason arrived in time, the pieces of the puzzle now fully clear. The look on Jason's face when he saw Ronnie holding Maxie hostage was cold and unflinching, his gun steady as he demanded Ronnie let her go. Ronnie tried to weasel his way out, blaming others, twisting his words, trying to cast himself as the misunderstood victim. But Jason had heard enough lies. He laid out Ronnie's crimes, one by one, with the precision of a man who had studied every angle and found every truth. Ronnie's mask shattered under the weight of Jason's words, his true identity laid bare for all to see. The fallout from Jason's confrontation with Ronnie was immediate and overwhelming. In Port Charles, secrets never stay hidden for long, and once Jason exposed Ronnie's crimes, the ripples spread like wildfire through the community. Maxie, shaken and terrified from the ordeal, could barely catch her breath as Jason pulled her safely behind him. The weight of what she had just witnessed, the mask of a man she once thought of as a cop, protector, and even friend, was too much to process. Her voice trembled as she told Jason that Ronnie had been manipulating her for weeks, threatening her with information he claimed could ruin her life. Jason's steady presence reassured her, but Maxie's eyes betrayed the fear of someone who realized just how close she had come to being a casualty in a man's desperate game. Jason, calm but deadly serious, assured her that she wasn't alone and that Ronnie's reign of intimidation was officially over. Word of Ronnie's exposure spread quickly, especially when Dante Falconeri arrived on the scene. For Dante, the betrayal cut deeper than almost anyone else could imagine. Ronnie had been his mentor, his friend, someone he trusted to have his back on the force and in the streets. Now, standing there with his badge tainted by association, Dante felt the sting of betrayal unlike anything before. Jason locked eyes with him, not with malice but with an understanding that this truth would hurt. He explained, briefly but firmly, what Ronnie had been doing, laying out the evidence Spinelli had uncovered and the threats Ronnie had made against Maxie. Dante wanted to deny it, to cling to the illusion of loyalty, but the look on Maxie's tear-streaked face told him all he needed to know. Ronnie had crossed a line that could never be undone. The confrontation spiraled into chaos when Ronnie tried one last desperate move. He lunged for his gun, pointing it not at Jason but at Dante, as if believing he could manipulate his old friend into giving him a chance to escape. But Jason was faster, his reflexes honed from years of surviving situations exactly like this. In a flash, Ronnie was disarmed, his weapon kicked across the floor. Jason held his gun steady, his expression like stone, but it was Dante who finally placed the cuffs on Ronnie. For Dante, the act was both justice and heartbreak, the final proof that the man he once looked up to had been nothing more than a predator hiding behind a badge. Back at the police station, the revelations only grew darker. Documents, recordings, and financial records painted a chilling picture of Ronnie's double life. He had been running criminal operations under the very noses of his fellow officers, using insider information to control both sides of the law. Even worse, he had been targeting vulnerable people in Port Charles, manipulating them into silence. Maxie wasn't the only one who had been cornered by his threats. Others began to come forward, their voices shaking as they recounted the ways Ronnie had held power over them. For Commissioner Max Scorpio, who prided himself on keeping the force clean despite the constant corruption that plagued the city, the shame was heavy. He stood in disbelief that someone under his command could have been so deeply entrenched in crime. Jason, however, wasn't interested in the politics of the PCPD. For him, the issue was personal. Ronnie had endangered people Jason cared about, and that made it unforgivable. Jason didn't seek glory for bringing Ronnie down, he simply wanted to ensure that no one else suffered at his hands. Still, he couldn't ignore the gratitude from Maxie, who clung to the knowledge that Jason had saved her life. Sam stood at Jason's side, proud yet uneasy, knowing how close they had come to disaster. She whispered that Ronnie's capture was only the beginning, because in Port Charles, exposing one villain often unearthed an even greater danger waiting in the shadows. As the night drew on, the city buzzed with the news. Conversations in Kelly's, the Metro Court, and even Sonny's penthouse all revolved around one question: how could Ronnie have hidden in plain sight for so long? For some, it was a reminder that trust in Port Charles was a fragile thing easily shattered by deception. For others, it was proof that Jason's instincts were unmatched, his ability to cut through lies saving lives time and again. Yet Jason himself felt no pride. Instead, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Ronnie may have been unmasked, but Jason knew the scars of his betrayal would linger in the lives of those he had tormented. For Dante, the night ended in bitter reflection. Sitting alone in the squad room after the paperwork was filed and Ronnie was led to his holding cell, he grappled with the reality that the line between good and evil in Port Charles was never clear. He wondered if his own faith in the badge could ever recover, or if he too would become another casualty of disillusionment. Jason, watching quietly from the shadows, understood more than anyone what it felt like to live in that gray space. And though he didn't say it aloud, his presence alone told Dante he wasn't alone in that struggle. The next morning in Port Charles, the air seemed heavier, as though the entire town was struggling to digest the shocking revelation of Ronnie's true nature. For years, people had passed him on the street, shared conversations over coffee, even relied on him in times of crisis, and now all of that trust had been stripped away in an instant. Sonny Corinthos was one of the first to hear the full scope of Ronnie's betrayal from Jason, and though Sonny was rarely surprised by the duplicity of men, he couldn't hide his disgust. He had always known that Ronnie wasn't as clean as he pretended to be, but the sheer extent of his corruption, even targeting women like Maxie and using intimidation as a weapon, made Sonny's blood boil. He told Jason in no uncertain terms that men like Ronnie were the worst kind of enemy, those who hid behind legitimacy while profiting from the very chaos they claimed to control. Sam sat with Jason later at their penthouse, watching him closely as he recounted every detail of the confrontation. Jason wasn't one to dwell on his own actions, but Sam could see the weight of it in his shoulders, the quiet way he receded into himself after a night of violence and confrontation. She reached out, holding his hand, reminding him that he had done what was necessary. Her words were meant to soothe, but she also knew Jason well enough to understand that peace rarely came to him easily. Still, Sam made it clear she wasn't going anywhere. She promised to stand by him, reminding him that every time he faced down men like Ronnie, he was protecting not only her but the people of Port Charles as a whole. At Kelly's, Maxie tried to find comfort in a cup of coffee, though her hands trembled so much she could barely hold the mug steady. Lulu joined her, her expression torn between anger and guilt. Lulu admitted she had trusted Ronnie more than she should have, and the fact that she had dismissed some of Maxie's earlier concerns weighed heavily on her. Maxie, though shaken, reassured her friend that Ronnie had fooled almost everyone. "He wore the badge like a mask," Maxie whispered, her voice breaking. "And I never saw it until it was too late." Lulu squeezed her hand, promising that Ronnie would never hurt her again, and vowing to stand by her as she processed the trauma. Dante's struggle was perhaps the most gut-wrenching of all. When he walked into the squad room that day, the whispers of other officers followed him. Some pitied him, some judged him, but all of them knew he had been closest to Ronnie. Sitting across from his father Sonny later that evening, Dante admitted the betrayal felt like a wound that might never heal. Sonny, uncharacteristically gentle, told his son that trust was always the hardest currency in their world and that sometimes the people who wore the whitest hats were the darkest inside. Dante wrestled with the lesson, knowing it was true, but it didn't make the pain any easier. He told Sonny he would never forgive Ronnie, not for the crimes he committed and certainly not for turning their friendship into another one of his manipulations. Meanwhile, the town itself was buzzing with gossip. Carly overheard two patrons at the Metro Court discussing the scandal, both of them marveling that Jason had once again been the one to expose the truth. Carly wasn't surprised. Jason's ability to see through lies had saved countless lives over the years, but she did admit privately to herself that it was exhausting how often Jason had to carry the weight of such battles. She resolved to thank him personally, though she knew Jason would brush it off as just another day. The deeper Spinelli dug, the more connections to Ronnie's schemes emerged. Shell companies, false reports, and a trail of bribes leading to other cities hinted that Ronnie's corruption stretched farther than Port Charles. Spinelli presented the information to Jason with his usual flair, declaring that the man had been a villainous puppeteer pulling strings behind the curtain. Jason absorbed the details quietly, already considering the possibility that Ronnie wasn't the only one involved. His gut told him this was only the beginning of a much larger conspiracy. For Maxie, the nightmares began almost immediately. She woke in the middle of the night, convinced Ronnie's voice was still whispering threats in her ear. She tried to put on a brave face during the day, especially for Spinelli, who hovered protectively nearby, but the trauma lingered. Jason noticed it too, and though he didn't always have the words, he made sure Maxie knew she was safe. A brief visit to her apartment, a simple assurance that Ronnie couldn't touch her anymore, it meant more to Maxie than Jason probably realized. By the end of the week, Port Charles had shifted. Trust had been broken, loyalties tested, and once again Jason Morgan had become the silent guardian standing in the middle of it all. Yet even as the town tried to move forward, Jason couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Ronnie had been caught, yes, but Jason knew too well that in Port Charles, every villain taken down usually revealed another one waiting in the wings. The true danger, he suspected, was only just beginning to surface. The late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across the polished concrete floor of the warehouse, turning the space into a canvas of elongated darkness and sharp, orange light. Jason Morgan stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the shipping manifest spread across the metal desk, but his mind was 1,000 miles away, or perhaps just a few blocks, at the Quartermain mansion where his wife, Carly, was preparing for another one of her infamous charity galas. He had promised he would be there, suited and booted, playing the part of the respectable, if notoriously connected, businessman. The thought made the back of his neck itch. It wasn't the suit he minded, it was the performance. The smiling, the small talk, the veiled insults disguised as pleasantries from people who would cross the street to avoid him on any other day. A soft knock at the reinforced steel door broke his reverie. Before he could call out, the door swung open and Ronnie O'Hanlon stepped inside, his familiar, lopsided grin in place. "Hey, boss. Just finished the sweep of the new dockside property. Clean as a whistle. No unwanted listeners," Ronnie announced, patting the small electronic device in his breast pocket that was used for detecting bugs. Jason gave a curt nod. "Good. Thanks, Ronnie." Ronnie lingered, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He was a solid man, built like a retired boxer, with a face that was both friendly and capable of turning stern in a heartbeat. He'd been a solid, if recent, addition to Jason's security team. A former PI from Buffalo, or so he said, with a knack for electronics and a no-nonsense attitude that Jason appreciated. He was reliable, he asked few questions, and he followed orders. In their world, that was as good as a gold-plated reference. "Big shindig at the Quartermains tonight, huh?" Ronnie said, leaning against the doorframe. "You heading over?" "Soon," Jason said, his voice a low rumble. He began stacking the manifests, his movements efficient and economical. "You're on duty here until midnight. Double-check the perimeter sensors. I've been getting a few false alerts." "You got it, boss. Not a mouse will squeak without me knowing about it." Ronnie's smile was easy, genuine. "Don't worry about a thing here. You go enjoy, well, as much as anyone can enjoy rubbing elbows with that crowd." Jason offered a ghost of a smile in return. It was the kind of comment that cemented Ronnie's place as one of the guys. He understood the dynamics of Port Charles, the unspoken lines between the old money, the corporate sharks, and the more direct, street-level power that Jason represented. An hour later, Jason was standing in the grand ballroom of the Quartermain mansion, a crystal flute of champagne feeling alien and frivolous in his hand. He'd done his duty, greeting Carly with a kiss that had drawn a few appreciative sighs from onlookers, shaking hands with Ned, enduring a barbed comment from Tracy. Now, he'd found a relatively quiet alcove near a floor-to-ceiling window, using the curtain as a partial shield from the cacophony of the party. Carly materialized beside him, a vision in emerald green. "Hiding?" she murmured, her lips brushing his ear. "Observing," he corrected softly. "Well, observe this," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "See Senator Lewis over by the ice sculpture? The one trying to look interested in whatever it is Brooklyn is saying?" Jason's eyes flicked across the room. Senator Lewis was a portly man with a carefully cultivated head of silver hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was a frequent guest at these events, a man who enjoyed the proximity to wealth and power, even its criminal variants, as long as it was sanitized by black tie and champagne. "What about him?" Jason asked. "I overheard him talking to his aide," Carly said, her eyes sparkling with mischief and intrigue. "He's in a panic about some old case. Something from his early days as a state prosecutor. He's afraid it's going to be dredged up before his re-election campaign. Something about a protected witness who disappeared." Jason felt a familiar prickle of caution, the one that always preceded trouble. "What does that have to do with us?" "Probably nothing," Carly admitted with a shrug. "But he was saying the witness's name was Angelo. Angelo Miranova? Something Italian. The point is, the witness was supposed to testify against a mid-level mobster, but he vanished the night before the trial. Poof. Gone. The case collapsed. Lewis always believed the witness was either paid off or silenced. But he said the method was too clean. Not the usual messy style of the family they were up against. He said it was professional. Almost clinical. Jason absorbed the information. Old history. It was the silt at the bottom of Port Charles's river, constantly stirred up, never truly settling. It was unlikely to affect them, but in his position, any ripple was worth noting. "I'll have someone look into it," he said, more to placate her than out of any real concern. "You're so good to me," Carly teased, squeezing his arm before gliding back into the throng, a social butterfly with a will of steel. The party wore on. Jason exchanged a few terse words with Sonny, who was holding court near the bar, and shared a look of mutual understanding with Sam, a silent acknowledgement of a complicated past. It was as he was making his excuses, ready to return to the more honest confines of the warehouse, that he passed by Senator Lewis again. The senator was now deep in conversation with a man Jason recognized as a senior editor from the Port Charles Press. "No, the file is sealed, of course," Lewis was saying, his voice a low, anxious hum. "But the alias the witness was using in the program, it's always stuck with me. So ordinary. So forgettable. Ronnie Shaw. I mean, you could meet 100 Ronnie Shaws and never remember a single one." Jason stopped dead. The name was a dull thud in his mind. Ronnie Shaw. It meant nothing to him. And yet, it echoed with a strange, dissonant frequency. Ronnie. He shook his head, dismissing it as coincidence. Ronnie was a common name. So was Shaw. He continued walking, the senator's worries fading behind him, but a tiny, cold seed of doubt had been planted. The warehouse was silent when he returned, the only sound the low hum of the industrial refrigerator in the small kitchenette. Ronnie was at the desk, scrolling through the live feed from the perimeter cameras. "All quiet, boss," he said without looking up. "Just a raccoon that set off the east sensor. Took care of the sensitivity on that one." "Good," Jason said, shrugging off his suit jacket. He hung it carefully on a hook by the door. The name Ronnie Shaw buzzed in his head like a trapped fly. He looked at the man in front of him. Ronnie O'Hanlon. Solid. Dependable. He'd vetted him himself, as much as one could vet a man with a seemingly clean, if slightly murky, past. There were no red flags. Just gaps. Gaps that were, in their line of work, not uncommon. "Ronnie," Jason began, his tone casual. "You ever go by any other name? A middle name? Nickname?" Ronnie looked up, his expression one of mild curiosity. "Not really. My mom hated my old man, so she never gave me a junior. Just Ronnie." "Why?" "Just doing some paperwork. Wanted to make sure it was consistent," Jason lied smoothly. "Nope. Ronnie Michael O'Hanlon. That's the whole package." He grinned again, that easy, trustworthy grin. "Boring, I know." Jason nodded, seemingly satisfied. But the seed of doubt had sprouted a tiny, questing root. Boring. Forgettable. Like Ronnie Shaw. He decided to let it go. He was jumping at shadows, seeing conspiracies where there were none. Paranoia was a tool of the trade, but unchecked, it became a liability. The next few days passed with a tense normalcy. Business was conducted. Meetings were held. Threats were assessed and neutralized. But Jason found his eyes lingering on Ronnie a little longer, noting small things he'd previously dismissed as quirks. The way Ronnie always positioned himself with his back to a wall, his eyes constantly doing a slow, systematic sweep of any room he entered. It was professional practice, yes, but it was more than that. It was the ingrained habit of someone who had lived with a heightened sense of threat for a very long time. Then there was his proficiency with technology. It was advanced, beyond what a standard PI would usually need. It was military grade, almost. The breaking point came on Thursday. Jason was in the back office, going over the financials for a new, legitimate import-export business he was setting up as a front. He needed his passport for the incorporation documents. Rummaging through the small, fireproof safe bolted to the floor, he found it tucked under a stack of bonds. As he pulled it out, a faded, creased photograph fluttered out and landed face down on the concrete. He picked it up. It was an old picture of him and his late best friend, Michael Corinthos, taken on a fishing boat years ago, before the world had turned so dark and complicated. He turned it over, a pang of old grief hitting him squarely in the chest. And that's when he saw it. On the back, in Michael's sloppy handwriting, was a caption, "Me and Jace, hauling in the big one. Off the coast of Shaw Island, 2004. Shaw." The name seemed to leap off the paper, a stark, black accusation. Ronnie Shaw. The coincidence was now a screaming siren in his mind. Two unrelated mentions of the name Shaw in such a short span, connected to a story about a vanished witness and linked to the man now serving as his head of security. It was too much. This was no longer paranoia. This was a pattern. He needed to know. He needed proof. He waited until Ronnie was out on a supply run. The moment the warehouse door clicked shut, Jason was at Ronnie's workstation. The computer was password protected, but Jason had ways around that. He plugged in a small, custom-built device that ran a brute force decryption algorithm. While it worked, he went through the drawers. They were meticulously organized. Spare cables, tools, a box of ammunition, a first aid kit. Nothing out of the ordinary. He was about to give up when his fingers brushed against a false bottom in the lowest drawer. It was a classic hide, almost too classic to be believed. He pried it up with his pocket knife. Beneath it lay a single, sealed manila envelope. There was no name on it. His heart hammered against his ribs, a slow, heavy beat. He slid his finger under the flap and broke the seal. Inside was a birth certificate. For Ronald Michael Shaw. Born in Rochester, New York. The date was right. But the document felt wrong. The paper, the font. He was no expert, but in his line of work, he'd seen his share of forged documents. This had the hallmarks of a very good, but very fake, ID. Beneath that was a driver's license from New Jersey, also in the name of Shaw, with a photo of a younger, leaner Ronnie. And then, at the bottom of the envelope, was a single, grainy, black and white photograph. It was a surveillance shot, taken from a distance. It showed a younger Ronnie, or Shaw, standing on a street corner, handing a thick envelope to a man whose face was partially obscured. But Jason would know that profile, that posture, anywhere. It was Frank Smith, a ruthless mobster who had been a thorn in Sonny's side for years before his eventual, violent demise. The pieces, jagged and sharp, began to click into a horrifying picture. Ronnie Shaw. A protected witness. A man who had vanished. A man who had been dealing with Frank Smith. A man who was now, under the name O'Hanlon, embedded deep within Jason's organization, with access to every secret, every vulnerability, every move they made. The decryption program on the computer chimed, signaling it had bypassed the password. Jason's hands were steady as he navigated the file system. He found hidden partitions, encrypted folders. He used the tools on Ronnie's own computer to break into them. He found bank records, tracing back years, with large, untraceable deposits from shell companies that Jason knew were fronts for Frank Smith's empire. He found scanned documents, the original witness protection agreement for Angelo Moronova, aka Ronnie Shaw. He had been a bookkeeper for the organization Smith was prosecuting. He had flipped, and then, it seemed, he had double-crossed the feds, selling his testimony to the highest bidder, Frank Smith himself. Ronnie Shaw hadn't been silenced. He had been purchased. And he had been placed. But why here? Why now, years after Frank Smith's death? The final piece of the puzzle was in an encrypted journal file. Jason opened it. It was less a diary and more a log of activities. Assignment: infiltrate the Morgan organization. Objective: gain trust. Map operations. Identify key vulnerabilities. Await further instruction. The most recent entry was from a week ago. The old man is getting nervous. Lewis is making noise. The past is stirring. Contingency plans may be necessary. The asset is fully integrated. Trust is absolute. The trigger can be pulled at any time. Jason sat back in the chair, the cold, hard truth settling over him like a shroud. The trust had been absolute. He had let a viper into his home, his business, his inner circle. Ronnie had not been a loyal employee. He was a sleeper agent, a weapon placed years ago by a dead man, but whose purpose was clearly still very much alive. He was there to destroy Jason from the inside out. And the trigger was about to be pulled. The sound of a key in the warehouse door lock snapped him back to the present. He quickly closed all the files, resealed the envelope, and placed it back in the hiding spot, sliding the false bottom into place just as the door swung open. Ronnie walked in, carrying a box of electronic components. "Hey, boss. Got the new comms units. They're the top-of-the-line models, just like you wanted." He stopped, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second as he saw Jason standing by his desk. "Everything okay?"